Some of the problems at the time in Europe were that there were preachers going around teaching the wrong thing about indulgences. They were teaching that indulgences were actually the forgiveness of sins. Now remember, indulgences are not the forgiveness of sins. They are the remission, in other words, the cancellation of any kind of temporal punishment. They are the grace of God helping us to repair the damage that our sin causes after we've been forgiven of the sin. People at least came away believing that indulgences could forgive past, present, and future sins, and that's, of course, wrong. It's not a get-out-of-jail card. Now, it's important to note the Church, the Pope, and the bishops authoritatively never ever taught that indulgences were the forgiveness of sins or that they would just let you be able to do whatever you want throughout your life. The Church never taught that. These were local preachers, and oftentimes they would lead people in the wrong direction. One particular preacher, according to legend, once said, every time a coin in the coffer rings, in other words a cup, a soul from purgatory springs. John Tetzel. Now, Tetzel actually pretty much for the most part probably taught mostly the correct doctrine about indulgences, but when it came to purgatory, he made it sound like every time you paid a little donation for an indulgence, that this somehow got souls immediately out of purgatory. And that's just not the case. We don't know that. Whenever we do a good work for a soul from purgatory, it's up to God when a person's purification ends. But also, the practice of donations sometimes was manipulated into a sales pitch, where men like Tetzel would actually collect donations almost like they were charging a fee. And this led to the myth that the Catholic Church actually sold indulgences. So in this case, indulgences actually sometimes were given as a blessing for any generous soul that offered donations, for instance, for the building of a church or the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the dome that was designed by Michelangelo. Nothing wrong with giving a donation. Even Jesus compliments a poor widow in Scripture who gives all that she has to the donation of the temple tax, and she's blessed for doing so. Again, there were ignorant and corrupt individuals who sometimes took advantage of the system. And in particular, some of the money that was coming forth didn't necessarily go to the charitable causes that people maybe thought it was going to. It caused a scandal. In 1517, the Council of Lateran V called for reforms, but bishops had trouble putting things into action. They did want preachers to be certified to make sure that people on the streets were not ill-equipped to help lead people and teach them the correct doctrine, and they wanted bishops to give permission for things that had to be printed from the printing press. In the same year that the Lateran Council, the Ecumenical Council, closes, later that year, a German Augustinian monk, a priest, obsessed with his own sinfulness, which is sometimes called scruples, where you focus too intently upon the sin rather than God's mercy. His name was Martin Luther. He had a genuine concern about some of the corrupt practices and confusion that was happening at the time, and he wanted to see some reform. Unfortunately, he took the wrong approach. On August 31st, 1517, according to legend, he nailed a document called the 95 Thesis to the door of All Saints Church in Wittenberg, Germany. The 95 Thesis basically outlined his idea about how the church should reform itself. The problem was, he didn't say that we should just get rid of any corrupt practices concerning indulgences. Some of what he said in the document and in other writings that he had published at the time said that we should probably just do away with indulgences altogether. They're unbiblical. And he questioned the Pope's authority to be able to grant indulgences. He also had problems with purgatory and the communion of saints, and he started developing ideas that weren't necessarily in harmony with Catholic doctrine. There is some historical doubt whether he actually nailed the document to the church door. Some say that he just mailed it. But even if he did do this publicly on this date, it wouldn't have been necessarily a rebellious act just to nail it to the church door, because this was the bulletin board for the town. Everyone went to church. If you wanted to sell an animal or hold a town meeting, you put a post of it there. But keeping in mind Luther's personality, he wore his emotions on his sleeves. He was very intelligent. He had studied law. He was earning his doctorate in theology. But he had grown up in a family of 8 children, and his parents were very strict. And he once said that his parents didn't master the art of being able to differentiate their punishments. In other words, they always apply the same rigid discipline discipline for whatever little childish misbehavior their kids committed. So had kind of a rigid view of God as more of like an angry judge rather than a merciful father. So perhaps we could take some pity on him, perhaps if his upbringing and his family had given him that kind of neurotic attitude. But he was also he could be very vulgar. He could fly off the handle and be very angry and very rash and very stubborn, and didn't always want to discuss things in open dialogue. So Pope Leo X, he actually wrote a papal bull, in which is a letter basically telling Luther that he was incorrect about many of his ideas and that he needed to reform himself first before we could really discuss reform for the church as a whole. So he asked Luther to take 60 days to think about it and to recant some of the errors that the Pope had pointed out. Luther responded, again rashly, very angrily, by burning the letter, refusing to admit that he was wrong in any part of his new teachings. So in January 1521, it left Leo no other choice but to excommunicate Luther because of his stubbornness. Germany at the time was actually not one unified country. It was made up of little provinces. Now, this is a modern map showing different areas of Germany, Protestant and Catholic today, which is as the result of some of the splits in the church that happened 500 years ago. Even though the borders have changed over time, the provinces during the 1500s were ruled by different princes. So all of them are under the Holy Roman Emperor, who has territory in Germany and all throughout Europe. These princes do not want to be under the yoke of the Roman Emperor anymore. They want to free their provinces and take church property for themselves and not have to pay tax to the Holy Roman Empire. So they see Luther as an opportunity to make a political move, and that's one main reason why they support him. One particular prince, the Prince of Saxony, Prince Frederick III, he had supported Luther, seeing this as an opportunity again to create this rival church in opposition to the Catholic Church, where the Pope would have been associated with the Holy Roman Emperor. This was an opportunity to have, in a sense, an independent church, a local church, where the local prince or king could declare by divine right, this whole notion of divine right of kings, that he had the right to appoint his own preacher who would in turn support that local government. By April 1521, Luther is questioned at the Diet of Worms. Sounds pretty gross, but it's another city in Germany. There, it's actually a political meeting where he's questioned in front of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and the questioner, John Eck, challenged Luther, who only would recant his ideas if it made sense to him based on Scripture only. Okay, this is a Protestant doctrine that's going to pop up. It's new. It's different from the Catholic notion of having an ongoing, continual tradition out of which Scripture grew. And even though we believe, again, that deposit of faith is closed, there's no new doctrine that's taught, only articulated and passed on by the church. But we believe that, like a three-legged stool, you have this tradition of the church, the councils, the creeds, the magisterium, the pope, and the bishops together helping to guide the church, and the permanent record of Scripture. But in this case, only Scripture was what Luther trusted, and a private interpretation, his private interpretation of Scripture. And John Eck challenged him by saying, "Are you alone wise? All the doctors and the martyrs and the councils and the popes that have come before you?" And they say that this bothered Luther for the rest of his life, this question, but at the same time, he was very adamant, very stubborn about his doctrine being the correct way to understand the gospel. In fact, he didn't really approve of any other Protestant reformers' ideas if they really differed from his own. It was either the Lutheran doctrine or nothing else. By May of 1521, the princes decide Luther should hide out for a while until some of the controversy dies down. Luther grows a beard, and he disguises himself going by the name of Knight George. And he hides out at another place in Germany called Wartburg Castle, which had been the home centuries earlier to St. Elizabeth of Hungary. And he translates the Greek New Testament into German. Now, this wasn't the first time that anyone had produced a German Bible. In fact, the church already had at least 13 dialects of the German Bible produced. So it's a myth to say that he was the first to translate the Bible into the vernacular of the German people. But it does become a popular edition of it. What's significant, though, is that while he's hiding there translating and publishing, he removes 4 books that he didn't really like: the letters of James, Jude, and Hebrews, and the book of Revelation. And another controversial thing that he did was add the word alone after the word faith in Romans, where St. Paul talks about the fact that we're justified, that is, we're made right with God through our faith in Jesus. We as Catholics, of course, believe that we're saved by grace through faith, and that continues in the Christian life through our works of charity. Not that we're earning God's love, but that we grow in God's love. And Luther had a similar idea. And in fact, the previous Pope, Pope Benedict XVI, said that Luther's phrase, faith alone, is true if it's not opposed to faith in charity, in love. Faith is looking at Christ, entrusting oneself to Christ, being united to Christ, conformed to Christ, to his life. And the life of Christ, is love. Hence, to believe is to conform to Christ and to enter into his love. So it is that the letter of Galatians, in which he primarily developed his teaching on justification, St. Paul speaks of faith that works through love. Agreements have happened between Lutheran churches and the Catholic Church in recent years, which has shown that there's a lot more that we have in common concerning our belief of how we're saved rather than what's different. And that takes us basically to the end of how everything started with the Protestant Revolution and Luther's actions. Again, to summarize, he was objecting to the abuse of indulgences, but his own solution to the problem of misrepresenting what the church teaches about penances and indulgences and purification was to change the essential church teaching. And that's where the church fell into disagreement with him. And of course, it's split the church in a way that it's continued down 500 years later to this day. But again, even though men on both sides were to blame for talking past one another rather than with each other, Luther still nevertheless should have stayed within the church in order to reform her. Had he been more cooperative, perhaps there would be a Lutheran religious order, just like there's a Dominican order named after St. Dominic and a Franciscan order named after St. Francis. We could have had Luther as a saintly person who tried his best to reform the church rather than somebody who ended up getting excommunicated. But we can still pray for his soul and pray for reunification between Christians today. No one's to blame for these splits that happened hundreds of years ago, and today all those who are baptized in the Lord are brothers and sisters, and we should work together towards reunity. But we'll talk about that at another time.